In this video, I'll describe how my object-oriented PHP code is able to generate a typical page like my home page. This page has a header, a main, and a footer area. The header area is from here all the way to here. Main is here and footer is here. The footer has two modal buttons. When you look at the source code, you see that there's a section with the header tag. It goes all the way down to here. Then there's a section for main, which is this part. And then there is a section for footer, which is all the way down to here. Actually, this part is also part of the footer class. And this part is part of the header class. It's all the way to the bottom here. At the top of our script, we have all the use statements for the elements, or shall we call them classes, which we'll use in the page. Here we define the variables message and error. Although they are defined in start.php, we have to still define them up here in case they don't get a value inside start.php. The PHP compiler will complain later on when we reference message and error if we don't do it this way. Next, as I've stated, we run start.php, and that will possibly set error and message. And if there is a catchable error when running start.php, that will be stored in the variable error. Inside start.php, if there was not a catchable error, there is also an error which could set the value of the error variable. Either way, as I found out, in start.php, message will be initialized to an empty string. So I don't even think that this is necessary, but PHP Storm also complains, not just the compiler. So that's why I have it this way. So far, what we have established is the contents of config.php, some constants for directories, an autoload function here, some functions defined in functions.php, a database connection, $db. Autoload.php is Composer's autoloader. Down here, we are registering a function called load main class, and that's another function that's used to load classes automatically. And then over here, we create the session object. It's going to be called $session. And then we have $message being assigned a value here. And $error was assigned a value here if there was a connection error. So now we move on to this section here. The only thing that we have defined, which I have failed to mention so far, is the constant called environment. And that will either have a value of production or development, or possibly something else. Next, we create a log action object called $logstats. And the constructor for this object will store in our database a record of the action, which is that someone loaded that page, which is index.php. We start off obviously by creating the header section of the document or the page. And the first object in the header is a Navbar object. The Navbar object contains Navbar item objects. So we're going to have a Navbar item for time, for mission, and for policies. The policies Navbar item has a terms of service Navbar item, a privacy policy Navbar item, and a license Navbar item. So that's what we did here. There's the time item is a navbar item, mission item, and the policies item. The policies item contains the TOS, PP, and L navbar items. After creating the navbar items, we created the navbar and then added the 3 main items to it. Remember, the policies item is a compound item because it contains other items. Next, we created the login form, and that's the form that's going to go in the modal. That's this form. So we created the form before we created the modal. Take special notice of how this web form was created. And keep in mind that we are creating this web form to be inserted in a modal. So here we created the web form object. Then we created the 2 fields that go in the object. Then we added those 2 fields to this web form. Then we created a submit input object. And this is significant because when we created the submit input object, we didn't add it to the web form. This submit button will be passed as an argument to the modal, and the modal will take care of inserting the submit button into the modal, which is a web form modal. After the creation of the form, which will go in the login modal, I created $header, which is an object that holds all the other sub-objects of the header. And the navigation object is passed as an argument to the header constructor. Over here we have 2 helper variables, which basically hold the opening and closing div tags for a container. And those will be used in several other places throughout this script to add the container element. And right away we got to use it over here by adding the opening container div to the header. So far, the header has the navigation and an opening container tag. Next, we create the login modal, which appears as a button. And this modal will contain the login form, which we created earlier, and its submit button. Then we create the join button, which is just a hyperlink type of button. Then we add the modal and the join button to the header. After that, we add the closing div for the container. It's important to note which elements require a container and which don't. For example, as you've seen in the elements we've added to the header, that the navigation object did not need any container to surround it. However, the 2 buttons over here we just added have a container surrounding them in the HTML. And next we have another example of what we just talked about. We ended up creating 2 other helpers here for a container div, and then we created 3 paragraphs. 2 of these paragraphs are headline objects, and we ended up adding them sandwiched in between the container opening and closing divs over here. And following that, we created the page object and added the header object to it. Next, we created the object main. Remember, we have a header, main, and footer. And the main will contain the content over here, which we call a service element, because it is commonly used to display the services which our website provides. So we proceed to create the service elements which will go into the services object. And right after creating each service element, we add that service to the services object. Then over here, we added the services object to main, and then added main to the document, which is the page. Next, we created the footer object. Within that footer object, we're going to add two modal tables. And for those two modal tables, and by the way, a modal table is a button that appears, which is for a modal, and that modal contains a table. So we're going to be adding here two table modals, and the content of each of these table modals will be what's in these two arrays. One is an array of the request headers, and the other is an array of the response headers. So over here, we create the table for the request headers. So the first part of the table that we create is the table row, which has the headings of the table. It's called the T-head row. And we create that by first creating the two cells, which each hold the heading for each column. And then we stuff those two cells into an array of cells, which goes into the T-head row. Likewise, we form an array of the rows, which will constitute the table body. And that's called T-body rows array. And then we create the table object, and we pass it the T-head row and the T-body rows array. Then, similarly, we create the table for the response headers, as seen right over here. Then we create the two modals for those two tables. And here we add a headline. It's not a paragraph. We create it over here. And then we add these elements to the footer. You will note that the two table modals go in a container, and the footer headline, which we just created here, also requires its own container. And then finally, we add the footer to the page, and then we echo out the page. Seeing how it is that this video has been pretty long, and that I also need to reflect on the content of this video before commenting further about this script, I will end the script at this point and possibly make further comments in a separate video.